Underway, I want to look at something. I forgot to say this yesterday in lab. And then remembered at the end, and Maya and Mercy were there, but it turned out not to be an issue. I had a doctor's appointment at Bay State that I was afraid would take me right up till 11 o'clock, and we get a late start. We were able to get in early, but I'm kind of pushing it here at the end because it turns out there's some road work on Main Street that had everything backed up anyway. So, I think one of you yesterday was asking about the chapter assignments that we have coming up, and I had been under the impression that one thing was true, and it turns out it's not set up that way. So I'm looking at the schedule to just deal with that. Now, because this is a traditional lecture lab setup course, I have it set up in Blackboard a little bit differently than my other courses. And what I had done for my other courses was to split the skin and skeleton up between 2 weeks in the schedule. And I hadn't done that for you, obviously. So this week, it says integumentary system and skeletal systems. So they're in one folder together, this week's folder together. Now, actually, it is really 2 weeks worth of stuff. The next week is, a week and a half worth of time. Next week, Monday is a holiday, and the school is having Monday classes meet on Tuesday, and Tuesday classes are canceled. This is something we have to do every so often because so many holidays fall on Mondays. Like, we didn't have lab the first week because that was Martin Luther King? No, Labor Day. Martin Luther King usually messes up the first Monday of spring. So with Columbus Day, that'd be another Monday out of the schedule. So instead of missing 2 Mondays in the schedule, next week, Monday's a holiday, and Tuesday classes are canceled, and Monday classes meet. Now, for you guys, that's not a huge problem because you'd be in lecture at 11 o'clock anyways. So just on Tuesday next week, it's an hour earlier, but about 50 minutes earlier, 10:10 will be in lab, so we'll also be in the other room. But then Thursday next week isn't really on the schedule so much because there's not a separate week for that. So we're going to continue on with the material that starts today in there. Okay. Now, so let me go to this folder and so I have 2 reading assignments here, just links directly to the skin chapter and to the skeleton chapter. So you can kind of think of it as 2 different weeks worth of material. The skin parts 1, 2, 3, and 4, and bones part 1, 2, 3, and 4 are there. And then in here you have a makeup assignment. I don't have a makeup assignment for the skin necessarily, which is fine because everybody's here today, and today's really where we're dealing with the skin. Nobody has to do that. But then for Thursday of this week and Thursday of next week, if you miss either of those days, there's a makeup for that. Speaking of makeups, I'm a little bit behind on getting the exemptions in, I think. Actually, I'm not sure. I might be up to date. Oh no, I wouldn't have put any tissue exemptions in. So if you're wondering if you have to do the tissue makeup assignment or something like that, it won't tell you on Blackboard. I think I was up through the cell makeup stuff, so I'm a little bit behind. But that's kind of common for me, actually, on those exemptions. So there are 2 sets of assignments here. The skin assignments are due on the 12th, which is next Monday, before Tuesday. And then the bone stuff is actually set, while they're in the same folder, the due date for that set for the 19th, which is the Monday after. Okay, so again, we're really covering 2 weeks of time. So I have the skin stuff due a week before the bone stuff. And in the schedule in the syllabus, where do you go? There we go. There just isn't a separate week laid out for that. They're in the same week. And then it does say here the 19th we have the practical, so that's the 19th is 2 weeks from yesterday. And that's when we'll have the practical exam. So we have lecture that week 2, right? Okay, my calendar in my head's all messed up, but it's going to work out for just fine. I might have to do a little bit of rearranging on here to make things make sense, but oh, no, I'm sorry. I wasn't paying close attention. This says the 19th, and then the next unit is actually the 20th through the 26th. So that is the week of the 19th. Okay, that's fine. So just the 6th through the 15th really represents 2 weeks worth of stuff, which is the skin and bone sections. Now, I don't have presentation stuff in here. Whoops, I'm not even in the right place. Don't have presentation stuff here for the skin and the bones. I will be getting those together, hopefully. Well, just realistically, it's going to be this weekend before I get any of that stuff up. I am going to do a presentation today about the skin, and kind of all that I would do in a traditional lecture presentation. So we'll do that. And before I get to that and have to deal with logging into Prezi, come on, book. Oh, just as an aside, anybody happen to try to get on the book yesterday? Website for the book? Okay. I had a student who wrote to me saying that she was having a lot of trouble getting on the book, and I don't understand why. We are starting the next unit in the book. So with tissue, which we're still kind of wrapping up in lab as far as the assignments you have to do. We're finishing up the levels of organization unit, but now we're starting into support movement, which is an odd unit of the things that are in there, but there's no better way to classify things. So there's the skin, and then, which we'll be dealing with today. And then there's a chapter here that says bone tissue in the skeletal system, which is an introduction to the skeletal system, and concentrates more on the organ structure of bones, and especially on how they develop and grow to begin with, and a little bit about how they repair themselves. And then there's 2 chapters here, the axial skeleton, the appendicular skeleton, that are the more lab-based information about where bones are in the body. The assignments that you have, the bones, parts 1, 2, 3, and 4, is out of the bone tissue chapter. Okay? The lab material in the next 2 chapters, that's basically like what you have in the lab manual. just the names of bones and where they are and what they look like. And we'll be dealing with that in lab next week on Tuesday. And then there's a section on the joints, which is what we'll be doing the week after the practical. So remember the practical's on the 19th, and the week starting the 20th, which is Tuesday of that week, we'll do the joints. And then we'll start into the muscle system. And again, with muscles, we have two chapters. One is about the tissue and the structure of muscles as organs, and the other one's more of the lab material, like what the specific muscles are by name and where they're located. You'll have chapter assignments on the muscle tissue chapter, and we'll use the muscular system chapter for the lab material. So, just to orient you to where we're going with the book in the near future, I wanted to cover that. Okay, now here's where it gets kind of weird. I don't always remember my login for this. Oh, I got a new one. Yay. Okay. Do I have anything here? Okay. So I want to pull up the presentation on the skin just to highlight a few things. But really, I'm going to deal with the skin completely today, everything I want to say about it. I will put presentations up online, which will potentially go into a little bit more detail about things, but we'll get to that. Now, really, as a chapter, as an organ system, I don't really think too much of the skin. Okay? It's best in this course as kind of a transition from the foundational stuff, chemicals through tissues, going into organ systems. So yeah, it's an important organ system. It's a big organ. It does a lot of different things. But I'm interested more in how I want to present it for you to think about how we transition from tissues into organ systems. And with the skeleton, we'll get into the organ system in a little bit more detail. In that organ system, we'll be. What I want to stress here is more about how the tissues make up an organ system. Okay, so I want to concentrate on the four tissues and how they fit into the skin and how their particular characteristics lend themselves to the functions of the skin. Okay. All organ systems are made up of various tissues, and which tissues we find in any given organ makes a big difference as to how that organ functions. And so I want you, with the skin, to kind of think about that concept in a sort of directed way. So what I have here is, first, just an introduction to where the tissues are in the skin. So every organ system is going to have all four types of tissue. And in the skin, the main place where we see an epithelial tissue is in what's called the epidermis. That's the outer layer of the skin. And then the connective tissue largely makes up the dermis, which is the rest of the skin. Within the dermis, we find examples of other structures that are made of different tissues. So we see muscle tissue in the skin. Within the dermis, there are blood vessels, namely arteries, that are going to have smooth muscles in their wall that control the flow of blood through the artery. And there's also in the dermis hair follicles, which are attached to smooth muscle, again, called the erector pili, that causes hair follicles to move. Now the name erector pili is hair standing up. Okay, erector instead of erector means to stand up. Why it starts with an A instead of an E isn't terribly important, but it's essentially the same word, erector, okay, for standing up. And then pili is just the Latin word for hair. So the erector pili muscle, its name tells you it makes hair stand up. Okay. Now, There is muscle tissue in the skin. What it does for the skin is not always that crucial, but trying to address the different types of tissue and what they do, I am going to talk about the erector pili muscle a bit. And then we have nervous tissue. Now, when we get to the skin, all that's in nervous tissue are the nerve endings. The cells that we find in nervous tissue are located elsewhere. But that's still nervous tissue, and it's still an important part of what the skin does. And I have listed there nerve ending, that should say endings, and specialized sensory endings, because the nervous tissue can work in two different ways. Either there are nerves that end that directly interact with the stimuli, like temperature and pain and those sorts of things. The nerve endings themselves are dealing with that. But then there are specialized endings that are wrapped around those nerve endings that are used for dealing with stimuli like pressure and vibration and those sorts of things. So there are some specializations in there, which isn't strictly nervous tissue. They're accessories to the nervous tissue, but they play a role in how the nervous tissue does its job. Then I also want to think about what the functions of the skin are. So the main thing that the skin does is it's protective. It covers the whole body and protects us from what's outside. It's a blood reservoir, which means that it stores blood. About 5% of our blood in our body is actually in the skin at kind of any given time. And we can move that blood around under certain circumstances when we need it. One of the times when we do that is in regulating body temperature. Okay, so body temperature regulation and the blood reservoir are tied together to some degree. When you're hot, what happens to your skin?
Sweat.
So you produce sweat. What else? How can you look at somebody and know that they're hot?
It turns red.
Yeah, they get a reddish color.
Blood comes to the skin.
Right. So it's the blood reservoir thing is about how when you're hot, the blood comes to the skin. Now, those two things, the sweat and the red, actually are important in how they work together. Okay. Why do you sweat?
So it clears the body.
Cools the body.
How does it do that?
The water is released into the air, which
What do we call it when water changes from liquid state to a gaseous state and then gets into the air? Evaporation. Right? What's causing the evaporation of the sweat? See, these are things people don't think about, but it's important to understand. You need energy to cause evaporation of the sweat. Okay? Remember when I was showing you the water molecule models, it was the movement of the molecules relative to each other. And the faster they moved, the further apart they flew, and eventually they evaporate away. You need to increase the energy in the water to have them move around enough to evaporate away. Okay? And that energy actually comes from the heat that's in your blood. So when your skin's red when you're hot, that's actually because all of that blood is there to help raise the temperature of the water that's on the surface, your sweat, so that it'll evaporate away. And by doing that, the energy needed to evaporate the water is basically pulled out of the blood. It cools the blood off, which cools off your body. There's another link between blood and sweat, which is sweat is just a filtrate of the blood. So as that blood's moving into your skin, sweat glands are going to be filtering the water out of it, as well as a few other things. And those few other things that get filtered out fall into the waste excretion part. Okay. This isn't something you want to think about too much, but the waste that you excrete in liquid form normally, okay, isn't only excreted by your urinary system. Okay. Sweat is going to have those same small molecules in it too. All that's happening in the kidneys is the blood is being filtered to get those small molecules out. Same thing happens making sweat. So the waste molecules that are in urine are in sweat also. So don't think about that too much, but yes, you do pee through your skin a little bit. So that's the end of things kind of tied together. Cutaneous sensation is a completely separate function. That has to do with the nervous tissue there that is interacting with stimuli that we feel at our skin, which can be temperature, pain, mechanical things like vibration and pressure. All of that's there. Okay. And then finally, the last one here, there is a metabolic function in the skin, which I don't spend a whole lot of time on because it seems like a very minor thing, but it is important. And that's about vitamin D production. You get a precursor to vitamin D in your diet. You eat food that has stuff, and that gets into your body. But in that form, it's not actually active vitamin D. It has to be sent to your skin where there's a chemical transformation to make that dietary source into the final molecular structure that is vitamin D, because the chemistry to do that requires energy in the form of ultraviolet radiation. And the only place in your body where you have an exposure to ultraviolet radiation is in the skin. So vitamin D production takes place in the skin. Now, vitamin D is important for mineral storage in your bones. Okay, it's the function of vitamin D doesn't have anything to do with the skin, but the production of vitamin D requires the skin to work. When you don't have enough vitamin D, then you're going to have problems with bone density and that sort of thing. I think, I want to say it's rickets, that's the disease that's related to that. If people don't go outside enough and get exposed to ultraviolet radiation, they're going to have low vitamin D levels, which is going to cause bone density problems. There are other things that can cause rickets too, but dietary sources of vitamin D, that kind of thing. But as far as the skin's concerned, that's where we send the molecule to be changed into its final form to be active vitamin D. Okay. I want to say a little bit more about protection, zooming in here. The presentation might actually zoom into all the different things, and when I make a online version of the presentation, I'll probably do a lot of that there, but I've already kind of talked through a lot of this stuff. But I do want to talk about the protection a little bit more in depth. And you can see that there's some small words written under these three things here that weren't probably even visible a second ago when we were looking at the whole list. So when we talk about the skin being protective, there's sort of three aspects to that we want to think of. The first is that it is a physical barrier. Okay? And here's where the tissue is really important. It's a stratified squamous epithelium. And beyond that, it's a keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So stratified squamous epithelium means that there's multiple layers, very closely packed cells, and it ends up being that the apical-most cells are flat, and therefore it gets the name squamous. But one of the things about a stratified squamous epithelium is that it has a lot of layers. The other stratified epithelia don't have as many layers. A stratified cuboidal is usually just 2 layers of cells. A stratified columnar, which we're not really dealing with as far as lab material is concerned, is usually just 2 layers of cells also. A transitional epithelium is going to be 5, 6, maybe 10 layers of cells, but still not that thick. Stratified squamous epithelium, especially because those apical cells end up getting squished really flat, can be hundreds of layers of cells. Okay. So it's a very, very thick layer. And then also, it's a keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. You might not be able to see this word right here, keratinized, but what that is referring to is a protein called keratin, which is what makes the cells kind of tough. Okay, what keratin is it's an intermediate filament of the cytoskeleton. Cytoskeleton is made up of 3 different types of proteins. There's really small filaments, microfilaments, which are made up of 1 protein. And there are really big filaments, actually called tubules, microtubules, that are made up of a different protein. And then there's an intermediate filament that's sort of between those 2 in size. All cells have the same proteins for the microfilaments and the tubules. But cells vary on what protein they have that makes up their intermediate filament because it has something to do with the properties of the various cells. And so for these cells that are in the skin, they have keratin. And what keratin ends up doing is it makes this protein mesh through the whole skin, holding the cells together very tightly. So besides the fact that it's lots of layers of cells, stratified squamous epithelium, the keratinized aspect of it also means that they hold together a lot tighter. Okay? And it forms a physical barrier. So you can scratch your skin, meaning abrasion. Things can try to get through your skin. Nothing can get through the physical barrier there unless some trauma happens and the physical barrier is no longer useful. But generally speaking, it should be intact and protect you in that way. Also, the skin, the epidermis, is a chemical barrier. Secretions from the epidermis, sweat and oil and those sorts of things that are secreted, have a slightly acidic pH, which will inhibit the growth of bacteria on your skin. Now, you've probably heard by now, whether it's from a Lysol commercial or just general explanation in the news media, whatever, that we have bacteria all over the place. Okay? Bacteria live on our skin. There are probably more bacteria on or in our body than there are actually cells that contain our DNA. Bacteria are all over the place. But the acidic pH that we have in our skin actually inhibits the growth of some of those bacteria and completely inhibits the growth of other types of bacteria that we wouldn't want on our skin. So it does help keep the bacteria in check. I have this under chemical barrier because it's not really a better place to put it, but the other thing it says there is, and let me see if I can zoom in on this actually, is UV protection. Now, ultraviolet radiation, you could maybe make a case for saying that's kind of a chemical thing, but what's more important is the chemical that protects us from that, which is melanin. Okay? Melanin is a pigment protein, and the way pigments work is they absorb certain wavelengths of energy and potentially reflect back others. Okay? So the color of a pigment tells us something about what it absorbs and what it reflects. A red pigment is going to reflect red and absorb other light, wavelengths of light. Green is going to reflect green and absorb other things. Melanin is a black pigment. Black pigments absorb all wavelengths of light and reflect nothing back to us, and that's why they look black. Now, the thing about melanin is, while it's absorbing all of the visible spectrum of light, and we see black, it's also absorbing more energy than that. It's absorbing UV radiation, which is not visible light. And UV, ultraviolet, is just describing that radiation as being slightly more energetic than the blue end of the spectrum, the violet end of the spectrum that we can see. So that chemical melanin absorbs all visible light spectra, so we see black, and it absorbs UV radiation. Okay, that UV radiation is potentially damaging to DNA, so it protects us against that. Now, I said a little bit ago that UV radiation is necessary for vitamin D production, and that chemical reaction takes place beyond the melanin protective layer. Okay, and then the third part of it being a protective barrier is its immunological nature. There's a type of cell in the skin. The formal name for that cell is sometimes it'll be referred to as a cell of Langerhans, sometimes as a Langerhans cell. That's what I call a dead white guy name. Okay, in science, a lot of things are named after the scientists who first discovered them. Now, it's not necessarily that the scientist is saying, hey, look what I discovered, everybody call it after me. It's that Dr. Langerhans wrote a paper saying, here's what I found in the skin and described these particular cells. And then the next paper came along and said, Dr. Langerhans described this cell and I know a little bit more about it. And it just continued on like that for a while until people just started calling them Langerhans cells or cells of Langerhans. Okay. All it tells us is who the dead white guy was that discovered it. Okay. Now, dead white guy name is a little bit snarky way of putting it. The more appropriate way to say that, and you don't have to write this word down, but is an eponymous name. The root of eponymous, NYM, comes from the Greek word that means name. So eponymous means that it's something that's named after somebody's name, okay? Which means dead white guy. And the reason why I call it dead white guy is because whoever it is most likely dead and was most likely white and most likely male. Okay? Now there are some examples of female scientists contributing or scientists of color, but really for the most part it's dead white guys. So we use that name. I prefer to avoid those types of names as much as possible because they don't tell you anything more than who discovered it originally. So I'll often put that kind of name in parentheses like we have here and give you a more descriptive name of what that is. Now, unfortunately for this, the descriptive name is not that helpful, but these are more appropriately called dendritic cells. And the reason why it's useful to use that name here is that dendritic cells are a part of the immune system in a lot of different places. And so I'm just pointing out that these cells in the skin are the same kind of cells that we see in other places. In this book, when you get to the immune system chapter, it actually talks about dendritic cells a lot more than some of the other books out there. So it'll tie that together a little bit better.
The same one in nervous cell.
Sorry? Oh, so yeah, so that's part of why it's not a great descriptive name because the word dendrite has a lot of different meanings. Really what dendrite means is branchy looking, like the branch of the tree. So when we're talking about neurons in the nervous system, they have these branch-like extensions, and we call those dendrites. That's not the same as this. This is a cell that has what looks like branches sticking out of it, but it's a different kind of cell. And apparently dead white guys aren't very good at coming up with original ways of naming things either. So we get the same kind of words used over and over again when they really don't mean the same thing. And that's just something you have to deal with in anatomy. Okay. So those are the three aspects of protection that I wanted to just talk a little bit more about. I already said this about the blood reservoir. About 5% of your blood is kept in the skin. If there's a time when you need blood somewhere in your body, not necessarily about body temperature regulation, but if you're going to exercise, your heart needs to start pumping blood faster. And so that blood can be sent to the heart and your blood pressure will increase and your heart rate will increase and that kind of stuff. That's not the greatest example because also when you're exercising, you're trying to regulate body's temperature. So the blood's getting into circulation, then it's coming right back to the skin to help cool you off when you're exerting yourself. But there are various reasons why you have a little excess blood in the skin that can be diverted somewhere when it's needed immediately without you having to suddenly make new blood. Okay, that's what it means to call it a blood reservoir. I talked about the body temperature thing, sweat, and the blood getting into your skin. I talked about the waste excretion. The same waste products that are filtered out by the kidneys get filtered out in the sweat glands. And cutaneous sensation, the skin is a sensory organ. It deals with, I said vibration and pressure, which are both aspects of touch. And there are a few other things, stretch and whatnot. Those are all kind of cutaneous sensations. And I talked about the vitamin D metabolism. Okay. Before I get there, let me, okay, this is to try to get those two things on the screen together. Just what I want you to think about, and you'll have some questions in your assignments that kind of address this concept. Think about how these tissues are responsible for these functions. Okay, so which tissue over here is responsible for protection? You can be more specific.
Epithelium.
More specific. The stack one. Stratified. Stratified splat. Stratified squamous. What you really need to get in your head for the sake of the entire AMP course is when you hear protection, immediately think stratified squamous epithelium. Okay? That's its only real function. Okay, let's see if we can try a different one. Which tissue over here is responsible for, say, the body temperature regulation / blood reservoir stuff?
The muscle, right?
Which part?
Which would be the subcutaneous.
No.
Epidermis.
You said muscle, right?
Yeah.
Which muscle? I actually talked about two muscles over here when I was talking about muscles. Which one's responsible for body temperature regulation and blood reservoir?
The erector pili.
So close. 50-50 chance you just been wrong. And that's why I make a point of saying blood reservoir. Now, if I was just talking about body temperature regulation, then the erector pili technically fits in there. But
The smooth
So
muscle.
the blood vessel.
correct. So it's a smooth muscle in the blood vessel wall that can dilate or constrict blood vessels and therefore control where blood goes. Okay. So when you're cold, the muscle constricts and the blood vessels are too thin and the blood goes elsewhere. Keep in your body, keep you warm. When you're hot, they dilate and the blood goes into your skin. Now I set that up so that the erector pili muscle wasn't the correct answer there, but we can say that's also responsible for body temperature regulation. However, when we say that, we're actually lying because we're talking about humans. We don't have that much hair on our body that making hair stand up on end actually helps adjust your temperature at all. But when you're cold, definitely get goosebumps and hair stands up. Goosebumps is just the hair follicles. You can see them as they move. They kind of make a little bump in your skin. Okay, that's what it is. It's just there's not enough skin, enough hair on your skin for that to effectively change your temperature. But that function comes from organisms that have more hair. And so if you think about a dog, okay, dog obviously has lots of hair all over its body, and it can make its hair stand up on end, and that'll help with temperature regulation. Okay? And I have a story to go with that. My brother used to have a Newfoundland, which is this big hairy dog from Canada, basically. My brother used to live in the New England area, and then he moved down to Austin, Texas, and brought the Newfie with him. The first year they were there, they were like, "Oh my God, Texas summers, dog with lots of hair. It's going to be horrible. Let's shave him." Okay, which kind of makes sense. No, not nude, but gave him a really short haircut, military buzz cut kind of. The dog was miserable all summer. Okay, so the next summer it came around, like, well, the shaving didn't really help too much, so let's leave it as is. And I happened to go visit him that second summer when Max, the dog, didn't get shaved. And the dog was not miserable because it had this thick, heavy coat, which it could control. And what it did actually is it made the hair stand up on end, and it trapped cool air next to its skin, which kept it cooler in the Texas heat. Okay, which seems a little counterintuitive, but that's the thing about hair standing up on end, is that you can trap air within the hair layer. Okay, and a Newfie normally up north is going to trap warm air next to its skin to stay warm in the winter, but it can do the opposite too. It trap cool air near the skin and keep cool in the summer. Okay. And so not shaving was a better approach there. Okay. So yeah, in humans, the erector pili muscle is useless for the most part. It's more tied to emotional reactions. You know, when something is kind of creepy or scary or whatever, you can sort of feel your skin changing as hair's standing up on end. But it's not functionally doing anything for body temperature, but it's tied into that. Now, let's go for an easy one. Which tissue is responsible for the cutaneous sensation? Ooh, I thought that would be easier. Come on. The nervous tissue, right. Okay, so just think about that sort of thing. I used to have an essay section of my tests, and the essay for this chapter was explain how the different tissues in the skin are responsible for each of the different functions in the skin. Don't have that question in its full glory anymore, but it's still incorporated into some of the questions you have. So be aware of that sort of conceptual approach. So I want to, and we have about a half hour left, and this is all I really want to give it. I want to just breeze through a few ideas about the skin so that you're familiar with it. The skin's made up of 2 layers, and the book will kind of make you think that there's 3, but the book is not really wrong. It's just not very good at pointing out the fact that that 3rd level layer isn't really part of the skin. The 2 main layers of the skin are the epidermis and the dermis. Now there's a region called the hypodermis, and I'm kind of stressing the hypo part of that pronunciation, which is down here. That's the Greek way of saying under the skin. Okay. The Latin way of saying under the skin is subcutaneous. Okay. So the subcutaneous fat and the hypodermic region, those are the same thing. And the name is really telling you that it is in fact below the skin. But functionally speaking, it's related to what the skin's doing. So this chapter is dealing with the hypodermis just because there's no better place to deal with it. But do understand that technically that's not the skin. Okay. Unfortunately, and part of the reason why this gets a little confusing, is some things that are in the skin will extend past the dermis and into the subcutaneous region. So especially in the scalp, hair follicles will usually go all the way down into the hypodermis. Some of the deeper sensory endings, like this thing that looks kind of like an onion, which is called a Pacinian corpuscle or lamellated corpuscle. Again, Pacinian, dead white guy name. But it's layers of things. So it's also referred to as lamellated, which means layered corpuscle. Some of these are down in the subcutaneous fat. Okay? They're responsible for sensing pressure on the skin, really deep pressure. And so sometimes they're pretty deeply located structures, and they can be down into the subcutaneous area. The blood vessels that are going through the adipose tissue of the subcutaneous fat are part of regulating body temperature. If you can get the blood below that fat, into or below that fat, the insulation of the fat tissue is going to keep the heat in your body. If the blood is above that fat layer, then the temperature of your body can be lowered as that heat is radiated off through your skin. Okay, so the subcutaneous fat layer is important for some of the functions of the skin, but it's technically what's below the skin. Okay. Now, this kind of information is sort of verging on information that's more about memorization than understanding what's going on too much, but I do want to point it out. The epidermis is segregated into separate layers, and those are enumerated here with these brackets. The lowest layer, which is really the first layer of cells right at the edge of the epidermis, is the stratum basale, which is just the Latin way of saying basal layer. The cells there divide, so that's where all of the new cells are generated, and they end up getting pushed into higher and higher layers as new ones are born underneath them. There are also a couple of specialized cells in that stratum basale. There are melanocytes, which are responsible for making that pigment melanin that I mentioned earlier, and there are Merkel cells. I don't know if this is an accurate representation of what they really look like, but they're obviously different from the other ones. Merkel cells are important because they have a contact to a specific type of sensory ending, and together they provide some information for senses of touch and that kind of thing. The cells that are dividing in the stratum basale, and then all of the cells that we see above that, are this type of cell called a keratinocyte or keratinocyte. How you pronounce it, I don't really care. But those are cells that are named for the fact that they contain the intermediate filament protein keratin. They start life down in the stratum basale as pretty cuboidal or columnar shaped cells. But then as new ones are born underneath them, they get pushed up to higher and higher levels. So this cell up here was born in the stratum basale, okay, but it's just been pushed up by newer and newer cells. And as they get pushed up, they become flatter and flatter until we get up to the top and we've got completely squamous cells. Now really we would probably call the cells sort of in the midpoint here squamous. They're more flat than anything else. But the name of the epithelium is really just based on the shape of the cells at the very top. But all of the cells that we see from here on out are keratinocytes. The next layer is called the stratum spinosum, which is actually named that actually I might about to say this wrong, but I don't care. It's either named that because the keratinocytes in that layer, or what I think is true, the dendritic cells I mentioned earlier have a spiny look to them. That's why it's called stratum spinosum. There are spiny shaped cells there. There is not a dendritic cell represented in this picture, but that's the layer that they'd be found in. And what dendritic cells are for is if there's trauma to the skin and some bacteria gets in through a cut, the dendritic cells are there to help alert the immune system to the presence of a foreign pathogen. So they're sort of like sentries. They stand guard at the barriers in your body and alert your immune system to when something's gotten through. So we see them here in the skin, those cells of Langerhans are dendritic cells. We also see them in the barriers elsewhere in your body, your mucous membranes of your digestive or respiratory, reproductive or urinary tracts. So if anything gets through those barriers, they're dendritic cells, so alert your immune system to their presence also. Then we move up, and from here on out, there's only keratinocytes. Okay? Though it's not pictured here, you can find those dendritic cells in the stratum spinosum, but the rest of what's here is all keratinocytes. The next layer is called the stratum granulosum, which is referring to the fact that the cells of this layer under the microscope have grainy inclusions, okay, granules. So it looks like a layer of cells with a bunch of little grains of sand in them. That's where the name comes from. Those grains, for the most part, are one of two things. Either melanin granules, which is kind of being redundant, grains that are filled with melanin, or they're pieces of the cells that are starting to break apart. Okay? When we get up to the stratum granulosum, the distance of these cells from the blood vessels in the dermis is so far that these cells are starting to die. And as cells die in a controlled way like we see here, they're not, exploding like you shot them up with a shotgun. Cells dying when they're supposed to die will sort of package themselves up into smaller and smaller pieces that can be cleared away. Okay? And that's what's happening here. So some of those granules are just pieces of the cell that are being packaged up as they're dying. But the cells remain. As we move up into the next layers, the stratum lucidum and the stratum corneum, those are all dead cells. Okay? There are these keratinocytes. We don't see nuclei in any of those in this picture because the nuclei and all of the other organelles in the cells have gone away because they died at the stratum granulosum layer. But the cells are still there. The keratin is such a great mesh for holding all these cells together. There's even dead cells on the outside that haven't been let go yet. That's an important part of the protective thing. Okay? anything that's on the outside surface of your skin up here can't do anything worse to these cells than they've already done to themselves. You can't make them more dead than they are. So it's a perfect barrier against all of those things that are trying to get into our body. Viruses infect cells, but they can't infect a dead cell. So viruses can't just get through the skin easily. Bacteria have various things they can do to living cells too. So presenting them with dead cells prevents them from being able to do anything to get into your body also. So that's kind of helpful. Now, there's 2 layers of dead cells because sometimes we have more layers of dead cells than other times. Keep that in mind. I've got to point out a couple of things in a second. I just made a list here of the different cell types that we just talked about. Okay. The keratinocytes are everywhere. Melanocytes and Merkel cells and keratinocytes are in the basal layer. Dendritic cells and keratinocytes are in the stratum spinosum, and then the other 3 layers are all just keratinocytes. So, this is a couple of pictures that I got offline. The bottom picture is a representation of what a collagen fiber looks like, and then the top is what a keratin fiber looks like. Now, these 2 pictures are not to scale. These are space-filling models of the proteins themselves. And each little sphere that we see in one of these pictures represents an atom. Okay? It's either carbon or oxygen or nitrogen, which are all very similar sized atoms. So you can kind of imagine what this looks like, based on the atomic size. And if you look up here, there are smaller spheres here, but these are still the same atoms. So if you could, and I used to have a version of this picture, I couldn't find what I did with it. If you could imagine taking this picture and shrinking it down so that the spheres in this picture were the same size as the spheres in this picture, that would give you an idea of the actual relative size of collagen to keratin. Now, why am I showing you collagen? Where have you learned about collagen? Here's a hint, not today. Collagen, anybody? It's a major component of what type of tissue? Not epithelial, muscle, or nervous tissue. Connective tissue, right, which is one of the tissues you just studied. Collagen is an important fibrous protein in the extracellular space of connective tissues. And so I'm using that as a comparison here because keratin is another type of fibrous protein that we're learning about here. I just want to show you fibrous proteins all have a very similar structure. The sizes might be different, but they're usually strands of protein that have been wound around each other, okay, like a braided rope or something like that. So we see that here. So, okay, back to that thing about the 2 layers of dead cells. The reason why we have 2 layers of dead cells is because there's 2 types of skin. There's thick skin and thin skin. Thick skin has both of those layers of dead cells. Thin skin only has one of them. Thin skin only has the stratum corneum, which is the outermost layer. Okay. Stratum lucidum is between the stratum corneum and stratum granulosum. And it's just not present in thin skin. It is present in thick skin. Now this should be a picture out of the book, and it's got a label explaining what the picture is. But this is thin skin at the top. Probably this is the scalp. That's one of the thinnest skin areas in the body. And then this is thick skin, which is probably the palm of the hand. Okay? So the palm of your hand and the analogous part of your foot, the sole of your foot, that's where we have thick skin. Okay? And on the sole of your foot, you can think of it as like the sole of your shoe. It's thick to provide some protection if you're walking barefoot. The palm of your hand is thick for kind of the same reason, except that we don't walk on our hands. If you have a four-legged pet, then the pads of their feet, all 4 feet, are thick skin kind of epidermis. We still have the same sort of thing, even though we don't walk on our hands, because the thick skin also provides some good friction when we're holding on to something. Okay? Whether it's a branch or a tool or whatever, that thick skin helps functioning with our hands too. And then everywhere else is thin skin. How thin everything else is varies where you're looking, but the thinnest, like I said earlier, this is probably a picture of the scalp. The other place that you have very, very thin skin, and I don't have a good explanation of why, is the skin right where your lip meets the rest of your skin of your face. If you've ever eaten spicy food, you'll often get sort of a burning sensation right along the lip line, I guess is what you call it. And that's because the spice of spicy food can get into the skin easier there, and so it's you feel a little bit more right there because it's thin skin. So now a lot of that's just about what we call the different layers of the skin and what they look like, what they're composed of. That's all material that you can kind of really get from reading. I just went through it quickly to orient you to it. Didn't quite finish talking about the layers of skin. So we concentrate a lot on the epidermis. The dermis also has layers directly adjacent to the epidermis. The dermis right here is called the papillary layer, and then the rest of it is called the reticular layer. There's 2 different types of connective tissue here. The papillary layer is areolar connective tissue, which we always find next to epithelium. Every epithelium has areolar connective tissue next to it because areolar connective tissue has a lot of space in it for blood vessels to get in. So the blood vessels to keep these cells alive are in the tissue right here. And you're always going to see areolar connective tissue and its blood vessels adjacent to every epithelium in your body. And then from that point down, the rest of what we have here, called the reticular layer, is dense irregular connective tissue. Now this can be confusing. There is something called reticular tissue. This is not reticular tissue. It's just called the reticular layer. The word reticular basically means networked. And in reticular tissue and in the reticular layer, what they're talking about is fibrous proteins that make up a network or a mesh that holds everything together. Okay. It's just reticular tissue and the dense irregular connective tissue in the reticular layer are different types of tissue, but they have that same basic concept of a mesh of fibrous proteins. The proteins that we have here are big collagen fiber bundles. So what I showed you a second ago, that colored picture of the collagen fiber, that's a single collagen fiber. The bundles of fibers here are going to be a bunch of those braided together. Okay. So if you look at a rope, you can take it apart down to really fine filaments. Okay. So you have a bundle of filaments that's wrapped around another bundle of filaments that's wrapped around another bundle of filaments to make a big thick rope. And that's kind of what the collagen fiber bundles are only here. Now, as we stain this, all of the pattern that you see in the reticular layer, that's the collagen. Sometimes you can see a region where a collagen fiber bundle will go on for a ways in the plane of section. But more often what you see are these little sort of floaty pink parts, which are really collagen fiber bundles that are going through the plane of section. We're just seeing them in cross-section or something like that. Okay. The collagen in your skin is just going all sorts of different ways. Okay. The point of that is that you can pull on your skin in all sorts of different ways, and you need the collagen there to bear that tensile strength. And so it's layered in all different directions to deal with all the different ways that your skin can be stretched. That's what we see in the dermis. Okay, within the dermis, there are some structures that are worth mentioning. I'm just going to very briefly mention them because, again, they're not that crucially important to talk about. The first thing I do want to talk about is somewhat crucially important, which are the different types of glands. Now, one reason why it's crucially important to talk about this is because the book doesn't quite go into the depth on glands that I want to. It does mention the two main types of glands, sudoriferous and sebaceous glands, meaning sweat glands and oil glands, and it talks about them. But the book doesn't deal with these other types of glands. And partly that's probably because the book is saying, well, they're located in very specific parts of your body. They're not all over the skin, which is true. So mammary glands obviously produce milk and are obviously localized to the very specific location in breast tissue. And ceruminous glands, which produce wax, are located in a very specific region also. Where's that?
Ear.
Yeah, so they're only in the ear canal, but they're an important type of gland to talk about. Really, mammary glands and ceruminous glands are modified sweat glands. Okay, their shape is different, and their secretions are different, but they're really just sweat glands that have been modified a little bit. Sebaceous glands, oil glands, are their own kind of gland, and the book does a good job of pointing those out. Well, now we can see it just fine. I was trying to zoom in a little bit. Under sudoriferous glands, there are two types. The names I'm using here, I don't think are actually the names that the book uses. And there are different sources that will call them different things. But there's two types of sweat glands. There are the regular sweat glands, and then there are the ones that are smellier. Okay. Now, the smelly sweat glands are usually called apocrine glands, and I think that's what the book calls. The book might call the regular sweat glands eccrine sweat glands. Doesn't really matter. The apocrine sweat glands are found in hairy skin, so at the groin and the armpits and around the beard. They're active only once puberty sets in, and they secrete hormones and lipids that are related, the hormones are lipids, hormones or proteins that are related to reproductive function, okay? So it probably has something to do with that. Regular sweat glands just secrete a very watery mix with a few small molecules that have been filtered out of the blood. Okay. This, I'm getting a little out of order here, but this is what a sebaceous gland looks like. This is a hair follicle, and sebaceous glands are attached to the hair follicle. They help by coating the hair follicle with an oily residue, which keeps the moisture in. And that oily residue will also get onto the surface of your skin, also providing a moisture barrier. There are some sebaceous glands, oil glands, that are not associated directly with hair follicles. They might be directly onto the skin or attached to hair follicles that are no longer growing hair. So there's a few different ways that the oils can get there. And then this is just a picture from the book pointing out, again, the book uses eccrine instead of merocrine. Different sources will use different names. When I get around to making a presentation version of this, I'll change that word merocrine to eccrine to match the book. But eccrine really is just a variation of the word exocrine, which means to secrete out of your body. So it's not actually telling us too much about them, but there are those two different types. But I do want you to be aware of these other two types of glands, which are associated with the skin, very specific parts of the skin, but there's still glands found in the skin. And I have here a couple of pictures, just public service announcement following the wax gland part, which is don't put anything smaller than your elbow in your ear. Have you heard that statement before? Okay. And I found that, well, okay, the first picture's there, George Clooney from ER, because there's actually an episode, and I've tried to get a clip of this episode where he's actually saying, don't put anything smaller than your elbow in your ear. And I figured if you're not gonna listen to me, maybe you'll listen to George Clooney. But I couldn't get a clip, so I just put his picture there. But then I found this lovely picture off to the side, obviously from Northwestern University, of what people will usually put in their ear instead of their elbows, okay, which is Q-tips. And the problem with that is you can damage the eardrum. Now, this is a rather extreme version of that. You have to really be working at it to get the Q-tip in that far and actually rupture the eardrum, but it happens. More likely what's going to happen is the ear wax is going to get packed against the eardrum. Okay, when people put a Q-tip in there and they clear things out, they're pushing that wax back. And the wax is meant to come out. It's going to trap dust, debris, pathogens, whatever, and come out of your ear to clear it out. Okay, and people that are really hung up on cleaning out your ears, there's a problem that you can damage the eardrum. I found this on YouTube. I just thought this was hilarious. It's one of those, you know, as seen on TV kind of commercials, where, you know, people can't do normal things, and so when they do something bad, it's like horrible. But see, that's kind of showing, one, packing the wax down, and two, potentially getting in there. I'm not endorsing the wax vac product by any means, but I just like the picture of the guy going, "Oh my God!" And so, anyways, oh, what was that other thing? Apparently, I have another YouTube video. Stop. Oh, movie, So I Married an Axe Murderer. I forgot about that. There's a scene where she tries to poke something in his ear and he freaks out about it. And then it goes on to talk about more stuff that's sticking things in the ear. That was all fun and games. See? Kind of freaks out about putting something in his ear. Okay, let's get past all that stuff. This picture actually comes from another book, and I'm going to change it out eventually, but it's a few different types of sensory endings in the skin. There is a picture like that in the book somewhere. I don't know if it's in this chapter, but I'll put something else in there. And then there are hair and nails. I really don't want to spend any time talking about hair and nails for two reasons. One, they're not very exciting, and two, you can get most of it out of the book. What is useful getting out of that is that they are epithelial structures, and really epidermal structures. They have a lot in common with the structures that we just talked about in the epidermis, like living and dead layers of cells, which the hair or the nail itself is the dead cells, and then there's living cells surrounding it that produce growth. And then also they have keratin, and they have a special kind of keratin. It used to be called hard keratin. The name has changed. It's now called, I don't know, keratin 13 or something like that. I don't remember. But it's a version of keratin that's harder, tougher, and that's why the hair or nails don't come off the same way that the skin, the epidermal cells do, because it's got a stronger version of keratin holding them all together. And you have to sort of work at getting those things to come off. So you can read about hair and nails in more detail in the book. I talked about this last time. This is a picture from a different book, but I showed you our book's picture because I think, Ismail, you asked about regeneration. So I already talked about this in terms of tissues, but I usually have it in the skin section of the book, of the course. One slightly nice thing about this compared to the picture in our book, it does show, the epidermal cells or epithelial cells will migrate around the wound site to grow in and connect the two sides. And so we can see there's an epidermal layer there as the scab is retreating or resorbing. So it's a better picture of how the epidermal or epithelial tissue kind of grows into that area there. The version in our book doesn't make a very good point of that specific thing. So, yeah. So that's all I want to say. I used to present this little case study here if you're interested, you can look at it, but I'm not gonna do that in class here. Any questions about the skin stuff? Okay, I will get presentations up online that'll go into a little bit more in-depth explanation about some of these things, but I think I've hit all the major things that I normally do. And I really wanted to get through that in one day so that next week we'll start talking about the skeleton. No, sorry. Thursday we'll start talking about the skeleton. We'll continue that into next week. And do remember next week, Monday's a holiday, so we're gonna have lab on Tuesday and no Tuesday lecture. Okay, thank you. Have a good day.